Hey everybody, today I'm out here in southern Washington taking a very quick look at Mercedes' latest insane sedan, or really AMG's latest insane sedan. AMG is a division of Mercedes that has focused on making high-performance variants of Mercedes sedans, but over the last few years, AMG has started making its own vehicles, mainly coupes and roadsters, and this is their first attempt at a four-door vehicle. This is targeted very directly at the Porsche Panamera, and I guess you could say at the very high-end options from Audi in the A7. But even though AMG is calling this the GT four-door sedan, this is actually not a stretched version of the GT Coupe that we have a video on the channel already about. This is related more closely to the Mercedes-Benz E-Class, but it's not simply an E-Class that's been AMG-ified. You could buy one of those, it's the E63 AMG. Instead, AMG took the basics of that E-Class sedan and they crafted this low-slung four-door vehicle. It's significantly longer, it's significantly more expensive, it's also an awful lot nicer inside. Up front, this definitely looks like the AMG GT Coupe and Roadster. We have the larger, sort of rounder grille than we find in most Mercedes products, but we still have that big Mercedes logo in the middle because, of course, this is still a Mercedes vehicle. Full LED headlamps below and an awful lot of cooling openings. One of the big differences between this and the E-Class platform that it borrows some components from is the overall length. This is 199 inches long. That's significantly longer than the E63. It's about 5 inches or so. And this is also about 3 inches longer than the Audi A7 and just hair longer than its direct competitor, the Porsche Panamera. This is, however, an awful lot smaller and more nimble than the Mercedes S-Class, even though pricing-wise, this definitely dips into S-Class territory. So if you're shopping between $100,000 and $200,000, you'd buy one of these because of its sporty driving dynamics and the insane amount of power we have under the hood. You'd buy the S-Class because you wanted the more comfort-oriented features of that particular model. Now, as with the Panamera and the A7, this is styled again as a four-door coupe. I do think that that designation is a little bit silly, but in Mercedes speak, four-door coupe means that we have frameless windows right here. There's no frame that moves with the window, so that way it does open and close more like a coupe. And then we have a reduced profile down here, which does reduce headroom in the back. And then, much like some of the competition, we have a lift back instead of a traditional trunk back here. Although practicality is generally not a huge consideration for luxury shoppers in this category, the liftback style definitely makes this a more practical cargo area than we find in the average sports sedan, something like an M5 or the E63. You could put an awful lot more back here, and you could stick bigger items from in here on into the cabin. Once we close this, you'll notice that we have a very rounded profile, much like we see in the Panamera. So this is definitely in that same theme. We have a power spoiler that pops up. It is in the up position right now. It obviously goes back down, makes us a little bit more streamlined. And then rather unfortunately for North America, we get these little bump stops right back here on either side of the license plate. But this is definitely more attractive than what we see in the Mercedes CLS. Even though the GT four-door is an all-AMG vehicle, there's still a base engine option, just as you find in the Porsche Panamera. It's a 3-liter inline-six engine that we've seen before. It produces 429 horsepower and 384 pound-feet of torque, thanks to a mild hybrid system. There's a 21 horsepower pancake electric motor sandwiched between the engine and the transmission that gives us 21 horsepower and 184 pound-feet of torque. According to AMG, that's enough to get that base model from 0 to 60 in a very quick 4.4 seconds, thanks to the 9-speed automatic transmission and standard all-wheel drive. Then we have this engine right here, which comes in 2 different power levels, just as we've come to expect from AMG. The base 4-liter twin-turbo gives us 577 horsepower and 553 pound-feet of torque, and if that's not enough, we can get this engine right here, which is the most insane Mercedes-AMG engine available at the moment. It produces 630 horsepower and 627 pound-feet of torque from the same 4-liter design. Both the 4-liter V8s are mated to a 9-speed automatic transmission. Now, I know there's been some confusion about that. This is not a dual-clutch transmission. It is still the same 9-speed automatic design that we find in the rest of the Mercedes lineup, but they've removed the torque converter and they've added a clutch pack. The reason they call this a multi-clutch transmission is that within the automatic transmission itself, there are already multiple clutches, but there is just one clutch between the engine and transmission. So multi-clutch because there's a lot of clutch going on, but it is not a dual clutch transmission in the same way that we find in some of the competition. So it's not a robotically shifted manual inside. It is the same overall interior design that we find in the rest of Mercedes 9-speed automatics. According to AMG, if you get the S trim like we're driving right here, then 0 to 60 drops down to 3.1 seconds. Just as you'd expect in a vehicle with a price tag this high, front seat comfort is absolutely excellent. These seats massage, we have inflatable side bolsters, extending thigh cushions, we have a 3-position memory over there on the door for the driver and front passenger, and these seats are both heated and ventilated. We also have a power tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion. These seats feel very similar to the ones that we find in the CLS and the E-Class. As we see in most coupe-styled 4-doors, headroom back here does take a little bit of a reduction versus the E-Class. The E-Class is pretty generous in the back seat, but overall legroom is still relatively good, and these seats are very comfortable back here. If you want the next level in rear seat comfort, you will have to step up to something like a Mercedes-S-Class AMG because these rear seats are not powered, although we do get a very interesting center console here with a touchscreen that we'll take a look at a little bit later. It's worth noting that although these rear seats do fold, only the outboard sections fold, which is an interesting twist. The result is that you can stick longer items on either side of this center section. I think this has to do with the executive package that we have on this model, but this center section again does stay in place, which means you can put longer items on either side, but not right here in the middle. As you'd expect, most of the interior components are borrowed from the rest of the Mercedes lineup. We have a pretty standard sized moonroof right there over the driver and front passengers' heads. Height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, and 4-way adjustable headrests. The rear seats feature a very similar design, and as we look between those rear seats, we find a large AMG logo embossed right there between the seats. Since this model has the executive package, we have this large fixed center console right back there in the rear with this roller cover over the rear cup holders. We then have 2 air vents right there at the very front. Moving back to the front, we find pretty aggressive bolstering on the front seats, just as you'd expect in a vehicle like this. And then as we move on over to the doors, we find an incredibly high level of build quality. This is definitely the equal of the Mercedes-Benz E and the Mercedes-Benz S-Class. The latest generation Mercedes interiors have really taken overall build quality to the next level. This model features acres of open-pore wood trim, a very similar overall interior design to what we find in the CLS and the E-Class, although not exactly the same, because again, this is an AMG vehicle. We do, however, find the same LCD screen setup for the infotainment system as well as the instrument cluster right there in front of the driver. The infotainment system features smartphone integration. We have air vents that are very similar to what we find in the E-Class. We then have the same sort of controls there, but a different center console. Behind this little cubby, we find 2 cup holders, the USB input, a place to store your smartphone, and then we find very unique controls behind that. The center console features a variety of very small LCDs. You can see them right in there, and this gives you the readouts for changing the modes rather than putting the mode change simply in the infotainment system or in the instrument cluster. Suspension changes, the stability and traction control setup right over there. Then on the other side, we have a little LCD for the volume. It's a little slider. You can barely see it right there in the sun. Auto start stop. It's a little bit difficult to see some of these. This activates the rear wing, and then the bottom activates the exhaust. We can make it louder or quieter. We then have an AMG shifter rather than the column shifter we find in most Mercedes models. We toggle back for drive right like that, forward for reverse, and then park is this little button right here. It is a little awkward to use, however, because it's right there under that shifter. The LCD instrument cluster is basically the same model that we find in the E and S-Class sedans with slightly tweaked software for use in this vehicle. It gives us more track mode readouts. And then moving out from there, we have a very attractive Mercedes steering wheel, although I am surprised that the airbag cover is not leather wrapped. That's something that we see in some luxury vehicles out there, and I do wish that that was the case, because as we move on either side of the steering wheel, you can see that the leather wrapping goes all the way down there on the dash. We do have flat sides, a flat bottom, perforated sections, very aggressive sport grips. It's a very comfortable steering wheel to use. We have down on the left as far as the paddle shifters go, and then up over there on the right, and the same basic controls that we find in other Mercedes models. The first thing you'll notice out on the road is that Mercedes has really done a lot of work on the MCT, or multi-clutch transmission as they call it. This is still not as smooth as the same Mercedes 9-speed automatic transmission with a torque converter, but it's an awful lot better than previous generations of this transmission technology. In slow and go and stop and go situations, this transmission is still not going to be as smooth as the regular 9-speed automatic transmission that we find in other Mercedes vehicles, but again, this is definitely an improvement over the previous generation model. Why did Mercedes remove the torque converter? Well, there were a few reasons. First, it helps improve overall efficiency. It also gives the transmission a very direct feel when you're in a particular gear, very much like we find in a dual clutch transmission. And they also tell us that it helped them improve overall shift times. Sometimes it's also a little bit difficult for torque converters to be able to handle the kind of power and the kind of torque that we find available in this particular engine, so that neatly solved that particular problem as well. Meanwhile, it allowed them to have a transmission that had a great deal of commonality with the rest of their automatic transmission line, so they weren't reinventing the wheel when creating this automatic. The Mercedes 9-speed automatic transmission is already a quick shifting transmission, but this has made it even faster, and you can really tell it when you start flooring the vehicle around. We get a huge amount of thrust and we get very quick shifts. Obviously, I haven't been able to officially 0 to 60 test this vehicle out here, but some publications that have been able to get right around 3 seconds, and some publications have even said slightly below 3 seconds 0 to 60, so just a little bit better than Mercedes claims for this particular engine. Getting a sedan that is this big and this heavy and seats 4 people in relative comfort and has massaging seats to go 0 to 60 under 3 seconds is very, very impressive. So how does this compare with the rest of the Mercedes competition? Well, the E63S is going to be just a little bit slower than this. 0 to 60 has a little bit less power. And at the moment, we do not have a CLS-63 AMG. That could be perhaps because we have the GT 4-door that we're driving right here, or it could just be that Mercedes hasn't gotten around to giving us one yet. Versus the E63 AMG, this GT 4-door definitely feels a little bit more nimble out on the road. The main reason for that is that we have the 4-wheel steering system in this model. This is the same sort of trick that we see in some large SUVs out there, and it really helps this drive like a smaller vehicle. In some ways, this feels a little bit more like a C63 AMG in terms of the size of the vehicle out on the road when it comes to overall handling maneuvers. But then we get a very classic large Mercedes ride. Even though this suspension is in the sport mode, the ride is still relatively compliant, relatively comfortable. And that really does pay dividends when it comes to carving a winding mountain road like this, because you don't want a rock-hard suspension out on a surface like this. The softer suspension helps improve contact with the road. If you have a really rock-hard suspension, then it's sort of like a pebble skipping across the surface of a pond, the tire's not making as consistent contact with the road as if you had a slightly more supple suspension like this. If you get the smaller engine in the GT, then we no longer have an adaptive suspension in that model. Instead, it has a traditional steel spring setup. Now, if you put this transmission into Sport Plus mode, then it does become a little bit firmer, but it's still quite livable. As the name would imply, this was designed to be a Gran Turismo style vehicle, which means that it's supposed to handle well, it's supposed to be fast in a straight line, it's supposed to stop quickly, but it also is supposed to be livable and comfortable. It's the kind of vehicle that you want to take out on a road trip, the kind of vehicle you want to be in when you're on a longer trip to Napa wine tasting, something along those lines. This is the kind of vehicle that Mercedes does incredibly well. It feels big out on the road, but it also feels very confident, feels very stable, very, very well put together, and of course, it is absolutely stupid fast. Comparisons can be a little bit tricky. Versus something like the RS7, I think this has a more nimble feel overall. The RS7 can feel a little bit front heavy depending on the road surface. The dual clutch transmission in that model is also not quite as smooth as this latest version of the Mercedes 9-speed automatic. The Mercedes is also a little bit more comfortable to be inside, and it flies a little bit under the radar versus that RS7. It also, in some ways, could be considered a slightly less pretentious alternative to something like the Porsche Panamera, although it's not like Mercedes is a discount brand by any measure. When it comes to overall vehicle personality, I have to say that I think that this model fits my personality a little bit better than the Panamera. It's just the way that Mercedes has combined everything together and the way this overall feels out on the road. It just fits me a little bit better than that Porsche. If you want to get your hands on one of these, the E53 version will start at $99,995. But if you want the twin-turbo V8, that'll set you back at least $137,495. And the S version that we've been driving here for 630 horsepower, that starts at $159,000. So this is definitely one of the most expensive Mercedes models you can buy in America. And as we've seen it here today, $184,295 was the price tag on this particular model, because we had things like the executive rear seat package, some upgraded leather, we had a number of other systems added to this particular model, and these $3,200 monoblock wheels. This particular wheel was originally designed for the Maybach sub-brand of Mercedes, but they decided to bring it on here into this AMG model. Let me know what you think about them down there in the comment section below. There's been a great deal of fervor online about how cool these wheels are, but I am not a huge fan of these wheels, I have to say. They look a little too 1980s for me, and I like the wheels that this comes with standard rather than the optional wheel package? Let me know down there in the comments section below. When I first heard that the GT 4-door vehicle was going to be more closely related to the E-Class than the GT Coupe, I have to admit that I was a little bit disappointed. I had hoped that they would just simply stretch the Coupe and the Roadster, give us a really cramped back seat in a way, but a vehicle that had those same kind of driving dynamics. The GT Roadster and GT Coupe are just an absolute blast to drive. They are the best alternative out there to the Porsche 911. But of course, the Porsche Panamera was what they were targeting with this vehicle, and the Panamera is not a stretched 911. It is closely related to certain Audi and Volkswagen models, as a matter of fact. But when you think about it a little bit more, the GT Coupe and Roadster are the best competitors out there to the Porsche 911. And the Porsche Panamera is not a 911 that has been stretched, so therefore this design makes an awful lot more sense when you think about it that way. Having the engine and transmission up front rather than the transmission in the rear means that we get more interior space, more room for all 4 passengers. Now, in the US, this is a 4-passenger vehicle. In Europe, you will be able to get a 5-seat version of this, but for the moment, just 4 seats here. In terms of overall driving dynamics, this definitely has what it takes to compete with the Panamera. But in terms of overall interior refinement, I do think that it falls just a little bit behind those top-end trims of the Porsche. There's one thing that that brand does really well, and that is interior design. We may not have the flashy LCD screens that we find in the Mercedes, all the same comfort options that we get as far as the seats inside, but the overall fit and finish, the design quality, the way everything fits together, and the way that it looks and feels really is absolutely extraordinary in the Panamera. But I have to say that if my money were on the line, I would probably get the Mercedes. I just like the overall look a bit more. I love the way that it handles, the way that it accelerates, the way that it feels, etc. This has that solid Germanic feel to it that I'm really after, and the Panamera just doesn't quite give me what I'm after. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and what would you choose if you were shopping in this segment? Do you think that this is worth the cost upgrade from the Mercedes-Benz CLS? The CLS is obviously a very direct competitor to this within the Mercedes envelope, as is the E63. So we have 3 very closely related vehicles in the Mercedes lineup. You could get this with the AMG direct badging on it, you could get the CLS-AMG, or you could get the E-AMG. You can think of them as 3 variations on a theme. This is the most expensive, the CLS is next, and then the E63 is sort of a relative bargain. In the meantime, be sure and find us over at facebook.com/AlexNautos. You can also find us over at Twitter and Instagram. Click that subscribe button down there if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you next week. I want to give a quick shout out to the Automotive Video Association. Alex on Autos, along with Redline Reviews, TFL Car, TFL Truck, Engineering Explained, and Matt Moran Motoring were all founding members of this association. And without this particular group, we wouldn't be able to have access to the cars we've had access to this weekend up here in Washington, and we wouldn't be able to get cars like this back to back or together for combined videos. So be sure to check out those other channels and see their takes on the same vehicles that we've been able to drive this weekend.